Agent experience is a discipline, not a specific tool. If you're thinking about, okay, I have to support agents, so I just need an MCP server. That's thinking far too narrowly about this problem. These are all solutions that are kind of under the umbrella of an agent experience. But the other reality is we have a lot of ideas about what works today, and then we're gonna prove those wrong tomorrow, and then we're gonna keep iterating on it. But we're right in the middle of it. And so where should you actually start? This is gonna be my recommendation. So the first thing, like if your team is just a bunch of one-person bands or not doing any of this at all, start with figuring that out, right? Like I think that there's a hunch, yeah, my team's using AI, whatever, like we're AI native. It's like, no, like figure out what they're using, ask them, figure out what's working, what's not. And this doesn't have to be a big effort. Get a Google form, whatever, vibe code it, and just ask them, what agents are they using? What's working well? And to be clear, don't ask them the question that we asked them a year ago, 2 years ago. We're like, have you tried any agents? It's like, no, like everyone's probably tried an AI tool, but what we want to know is what people are using every day or every other day, what's working, what's not. And it's important to understand that for many reasons, but not least of which is the fact that there are lots of AI agents and tools and combinations of them. And then all the work that you're going to be doing to improve the agent experience, this helps scope it much better. Just understand what people are doing. If they're using spec-driven development, that might be a little different looking of an agent experience than if they're using some other tool or they're really into stuff like Lovable or Bolt.new, things like that. So audit what people are doing, figure out what's going on, and then start to build your internal community, right? All that really, all that is really involved in doing that is getting them together infrequently, but get them together to talk about the issues that they're running into, talk about the tools that they're using. If you really want to learn something cool, come up with a problem or take some ticket off the board and say, hey, I'm going to solve this together and I'm going to watch you solve it your way, I'm going to solve it my way, and we're going to learn together. And that's some version of pair programming here, where there's also an AI agent involved. And that is so illuminating in terms of like what people understand differently about the different, either the code base, how they approach the problem, and it will also start to build up your internal community to build towards an agent experience. So, taking the next step forward, right? You know the agents that you need to support. Now you need to help them be better. Guy did a fantastic job of explaining this for me earlier with some data around backing up that the LLMs themselves are not sufficient in terms of understanding your code base. And the reality is if there is a gap in knowledge, it will confidently make things up or decide for you. It's not always made up, false, it just might just be totally different. Like his example of picking a theme that was not the right theme. To combat this, right, context files are where you need to spend your initial time, right? Either, depending on the tools, right, agents.md files, steering files, Claude files, Claude.md files. These are going to be very important nuggets of information. And, some rules of thumb that I think about is if you couldn't simplify something, make it obvious, right? So many code bases you see like, okay, to run a test suite, it's this some magical command that you got to run. That's not obvious. If you have those, make sure that they're in your context. Other areas are like if you have a decoupled architecture, so you have a front end that's decoupled from your back end, which might be decoupled from your data layer, et cetera. It doesn't necessarily know those connections, and you need to make those clear, or it will make those connections, it'll make them up every time. And that's going to be incredibly important. And especially whenever you get into this world of, as people are iterating on this, and they start finding that, hey, something that we thought was obvious wasn't, it's going to keep making those things up, and adding those into your agents files and steering files is going to be incredibly important. The next thing I mentioned is the core dependency documentation. I'd mentioned the core dependency of the front end has a dependency on this back end. It's over here. Here's how you use it. Here's how you find information about it. And that's incredibly important. But there's also this problem of dependency documentation in like third-party modules, things like that, even first-party separated modules. And Guy went in a lot of detail about that. This has been bothering me for so long because the reality is, especially with brownfield type of projects, is I have developers, or sort of the model is trained on version 1 of my API. The latest version is version 3, but all my developers are using version 2. And so like, it messes it up 9 times out of 10. And the tooling for getting this right isn't great today. I was actually, writing this, I was very stoked to see Tessl's, registry and things like that they're doing. And so I'm going to explore that more. I think that's very exciting. And I definitely agree that there's actually more onus needs to be put on the open source community to deliver these things. The way I kind of see the Tessl registry is like, well, if every dependency had to have its types hosted somewhere else, right? Like really the types, the documentation for it really needs to be there. But we also have the second problem where, especially open source repos, there's people who build on them, and then there's people who use them, and those are different documentation. And so like it still gets a little bit harder and harder the more you try to optimize. But again, we're all figuring this out together, so that's fine. If you use Context 7, that's also something that people use. I've run into issues with it not doing very well on the versioning side of things. But regardless, if you have a key dependency that's a third-party module, make sure it's in your context. Make sure you're using it right, especially if it's things like data-based, because it's just such a dense topic and tool set that it ends up getting pretty confused with those types of tools. So make it clear. And especially for very large code bases, the concept of knowledge graphs, there's many different implementations of them. Cognition released DeepWiki and code maps recently. But it's this, the reality is if you have a really large code base and you're asking it to do things, every time that you try to ask it to do something, it's got to kind of figure it out on its own. And the larger the code base, the longer that takes, the more expensive it is, the more likely it is it's going to miss parts or get confused. And this is where knowledge graphs really come in, where you can kind of pre-produce this kind of understanding of the overall architecture, how things relate to one another, and summarize those. And so before it tries to do things, it consults there first. And those are very helpful for larger code bases. Feedback loops are going to be incredibly important. So if you're already getting your internal community together, working with them to say, look, whenever we're having an issue, if a human had to manually intervene in an agent's workflow, get that documented, get that into context. If you're talking to that senior engineer who's been there for 15 years and has all the tribal knowledge in their head, every time you have to consult them, if that doesn't go back in documentation or context, I don't know what you're doing. But like that's this internal feedback loop. You have to have some forcing functions to make sure that your agents understand, because unlike you, they can't go ask necessarily that tenured developer who has all the information in their head. So establish feedback loops with your internal team. One practice that I really enjoy doing is I have this MCP where it's like, okay, if the agent's really going off the rails here, I have it look back and say, what could we have done better here? I mean, it's like an agent therapy session. Like what should we do better to make sure that you're gonna get this right next time? And specifically update the context files to make sure that happens. And then especially like once we do that, assuming it makes sense at the time, having it try again and then go from there. I have a lot of good results with that as well. I'm sure most of you, if not all of you, are using AI review tools in your code bases and your CI pipelines and such. So I won't go too deep into that, but like the one thing that I think is an addition on top of that is not only having your AI review tool figure out what's wrong with a thing, but also suggests when there are patterns that were missing from your context files that would have prevented this from happening in the future. So like this is, you're getting towards a step of trying to automate some of this feedback loop.